Senator Phil Gramm, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.
Thank you, Ben.
I have to say that I have an abundance of Phil Gramm memorabilia, probably more than the average American, including a Phil Gramm for President hat.
Oh, wow.
That I would like
very
to
select group.
Well, John gave it to me because he knew I was such a fan. So.
Well, I love your father-in-law, and I say it in the present. I don't buy into this thing. I love somebody and I stop loving them when they're dead. My grandmother's been dead 50 years and I still love her.
That is a good approach, sir. I have to say it's a very interesting gap in time to look at between the point where someone like you was viewed as someone who was the leader of conservatism in America to a certain extent to today, and there seems to be a lot of differences and a lot of things. But I wanted to just get your take on sort of the way the Senate behaves today, because it seems very different than the way that it used to behave for a lot of different reasons. And I wonder what your own analysis is of why that is.
Well, first of all, there's this tendency for old guys to think they were there when things were wonderful and they've gone to hell after they left. But I think there are two things that are clearly different. One is people are far more willing to attack people personally and impugn their motives, which is something you could have never gotten away with when I was in the Senate. And I think that's harmful. It's sort of like you get into an argument with your spouse and she says something, you say something, she says something, you say something. Pretty soon you forgot what the argument was about, but you remember what you said and what they said. But the second thing is far more important. When I was there, Senator Byrd was one of my really good friends and allies. And I was able to work with Ted Kennedy, and I was able to work with Joe Biden. But in those days, they wanted more government, which I did not want. I wanted more freedom. But they didn't want to remake the economic system of the country. They didn't want to tear down the old America and build a new collectivist America. And as a result, it's much harder to have any kind of broad compromise today. How do you compromise with somebody who wants to destroy the greatest economy the world has ever known and rebuild it in the image of Eastern Europe? It's hard to have bipartisanship under those circumstances. Now, maybe that will change. The American people have got to decide what kind of country do we want, and you decide that in elections. So we're getting ready to have one. So maybe we're moving in the direction of deciding.
Your new book delves into perhaps the most significant economic debate that is currently taking place in our politics, namely a debate about whether inequality is something that needs or requires massive government intervention into the marketplace and into our society in order to alleviate it. And you approach it basically by saying that the Census Bureau is using both the wrong measures, ignoring certain things, ignoring many factors that would actually show that the American system has created a much better way of life for most Americans than the one we typically see in the pages of the New York Times. Tell me how this came about and what the key aspects of it are.
Okay.
That you diagnose as the problem in your book.
Well, for about 20 years, I've noticed a growing separation between what the census says is happening to household income, which is the building block of our measure of poverty, It's the building block of the measure of income inequality. It's the building block of what is happening to our income over time. I've noticed a growing gap between what the census says and other clear measures by government and in the private sector. I'll just give you an example. For the last 10 years, the Census Bureau has put out a number as to what income is in American households by quintiles, 5 different quintiles. The Bureau of Labor Statistics has also issued consumption by the 5 quintiles. And guess what? The bottom quintile of income earners in America routinely for a decade has consumed twice as much as its income. The second quintile has consumed 11% more, and the top quintile has consumed 50% less than their income, even though there is no evidence whatsoever that savings through the accumulation of assets is anything like the level you would have with a 50% savings rate. Now, how is that possible? Well, it's possible because going back to 1947, when the census started calculating household income, they made decisions that were simplifications then, but have become very important now, that they did not count transfer payments that were not paid directly in cash equivalent. Now, in 1947, that wasn't a bad estimate, but what has happened over time, especially since the war on poverty, is we now have a situation where census counts only $0.9 trillion of government transfers as income to the people who got the benefit, and we currently have transfer payments of $2.8 trillion. So they're not counting 2/3 of the benefits that people are getting as their income. Secondly, they don't take any account of taxes. So we now have a situation where they don't count refundable tax credits, which you get in a federal check, because they don't count taxes. They don't count food stamps, and you get a debit card and you go to the grocery store with a debit card like you go with a credit card. They don't count Medicaid, where the government pays for your health care. They don't count housing subsidies. They don't count over 100 other federal, state, and local transfer payments. And when you take into account that transfer payments are income to the people that get them, taxes are income lost to the people that pay them. The census says the ratio between the top 20% and the bottom is 16.7, but in fact, it's 4.0. The census says the poverty rate is about 12%, or was right before the pandemic and the explosion of benefits. But when you take into account all the transfer payments, they have risen from $9,700 per household in the bottom quintile in 1965 to $45,400 per average household in the bottom 20% of household earners. And so when you take that into account, we've got somewhere around 2.5% of the people that are poor. Most of them have fallen through the cracks because of mental illness and drug addiction. And we keep pouring more and more money into programs that aren't reaching the people that are really poor. And the people that are getting the money have not been poor for a very, very long time. And then final point, The Economist magazine tells us that it is universally accepted that income inequality is high and it's growing. Bernie Sanders says the growth of inequality is obscene and unsustainable. Now, listen to this. We show that when you count all transfer payments as income gained, and when you count all taxes, income lost, counting everything, that actually income inequality is slightly lower than it was in 1947. So we are having a debate about the future of the greatest economy in the history of the world, where people want to remake it to reduce income inequality, when in fact income inequality is lower today than it was when World War II ended.
You know, it's an incredible thing.
Yeah, it's incredible.
And I have to ask you just a personal question. You know, I recall from my days on Capitol Hill working for Senator Cornyn, and I recall, you know, my days, you know, working with a lot of people who had issues with the CBO, for instance. What is the issue when it comes to the Census Bureau that it does not include, that it has made the decision not to include these transfer payments as income? Because why would you want to make things look worse than they actually are?
Well, one of the things, Ben, that I try to do in the book is not to get into what the motives are. I think when they set out this system in 1947, it was a good approximation of reality, and they didn't have the ability to measure all these things. But what has happened over the ensuing 70 years, they measure every one of these things. They report all this data separately, but they don't count it in income. So it creates a total misperception. And I'll just give you an example. President Biden said in 2021 that by dramatically increasing the child tax credit, that we would cut the poverty rate among children in half. Okay? They dramatically increased the tax credit, and what happened to the official census measure for children? It didn't change because they didn't count the tax credit. Now, they were forced to come out and say, really for the second time ever, admitted that they weren't counting it, but if you did count it, that the rate would have gone down. But the point is the official number doesn't have it in it, and so we'll be debating this for years to come, and people will be arguing, we've got 12% poverty in America. We shouldn't tolerate it. We should provide more money. We provide the money. It's not counted. And then we debate it again a few years later. And the point is that we have raised these benefits so high that because transfer payments have grown far faster than the income of working Americans since 1965, when the war on poverty started. So the bottom 60% of American families now earn almost the same income or get about the same income. And what that's done is that if you can get about as much not working as you can get for working, why would we be shocked that a lot of Americans have stopped working? And in fact, of the 68% of work age people in the bottom 20% of the income distribution worked in 1965, today it's only 36%. And the labor force participation rate is falling in the second quintile. And with this big increase in spending for entitlements during the pandemic, it's falling in the middle income quintile. And if everybody's riding in the wagon, who's going to pull it?
So that was my next question, actually. I just talked in the last week to Nicholas Eberstadt of AEI about his updated version of Men Without Work. The situation that we face right now in terms of the American experience is that there are masses of Americans who are out of work, are out of the labor force, are not looking for work. And in every town across the country, we see these signs in the windows of, virtually every establishment with help wanted. And they are incapable of finding that kind of help. how can we try to get those folks to get back to work in a responsible way that is not cruel to those who actually need help, but really does drive the able-bodied and middle-aged back into the workforce?
Well, first of all, we're not doing people any favor by paying them not to work, because in America, advancement depends on being in the marketplace. The American economy is an escalator. And if you want to benefit from economic growth, you got to be part of the economy. The people that dropped out of the labor market between 1965 and now, they are just detached from the economy, and they've not benefited from the tremendous growth we've had. So how do you do it? I think the only way that you can do it, if you're going to pay the level of benefits we're now paying, is to have a mandatory work requirement for means-tested programs. We did it during the Clinton administration, but we did it for a very small part of the welfare program, aid to families with dependent children. It produced a dramatic result. The most successful program of my political career in terms of changing behavior was the Clinton welfare reform. We need that reform applied to every means-tested program in America. I think that would be the right beginning in getting people back to work.
I wanted to ask you a couple of questions about the Republicans in Congress. There's a dominant narrative about Republicans today that basically says, in the post-Trump era, that they no longer care about fiscal responsibility or deficits. Whether you think this narrative is true or not, it's the one that certainly is advanced by the media and is believed by a lot of folks in Washington. How can we get back to a Republican Party that does care about these matters if we believe that they matter, as I do, and I assume that you do?
Well, first of all, not trying to be critical, but President Trump did not care about the deficit or about spending or about the size of government. To what degree that is reflective of rank and file Republicans, I think is debatable. I think Republicans have been too quick to go with programs that ended up spending a lot of money that achieve relatively little. The last Trump stimulus bill was ill-advised and shouldn't have been done. The Biden bill was totally irresponsible. You can't increase spending by 50% in 1 year and not expect prices to go up. I mean, you got to believe in miracles to think that's possible. But you have had, I think there's a lot of pressure to compromise, to show you can work across the aisle, but that has produced also some bad results. I think the so-called CHIP bill, which spent billions of dollars basically subsidizing chip manufacturers in an era where A, there's already been massive investments. B, every one of them is losing money because of oversupply. And by the time all this money is spent, we will have a glut of computer chips. And that's what happens when government is basically directing the flow of goods and services. If we want the private sector to invest, we need to provide incentives for them to invest, but let them decide. So I'm ready for a Republican Party that says no to spending. And God knows if there's ever been an era where there's plenty of room to reduce or at least control federal spending, it's now. There's more fat in this budget than any budget in American history by far, maybe more than all of them combined. So it's sort of like a Republican leader in the House once asked me, I was trying to explain that we needed to cut spending. And so Tom DeLay said, well, where would you cut? And I said, everywhere. That's a good start. So the point being, we need to set some high standards because we're running big deficits, we're running up debt, we're going to have to pay interest on that debt, and we're jeopardizing our ability to meet the basic needs of Americans in programs like Social Security. And someday, these people are going to regret doing this. And unfortunately, this someday is not going to be far in the distant future. That's the problem.
So one of the things that I wanted to ask you about is there does seem to be, an appetite for, at least in this moment when so many people have concerns about the economy, concerns about inflation, for, an advocacy for capitalism as being a good thing. But at the same time, there is this kind of faction that has developed, not just on the left, but on the right, that basically judges the ramifications of capitalism based on the fact that a lot of corporations have gone woke, have gone to the left when it comes to social policy and the like. And they use this as an argument to sort of say, capitalism or the Enlightenment era kind of form of classical liberalism is decadent, that it's backward, or that it is not something that we ought to continue to pursue. I hear this from many of my more some of my conservative friends who are particularly Catholic or that kind of thing, and it makes me concerned.
Well, it should. Because it makes me concerned.
Yeah, because I'm definitely a fan of capitalism. I'm a fan of the Enlightenment. I think it's a good thing. I think it's good for humanity. What's the best argument that you have or that you would use as a response to the people who basically say, capitalism, sure, maybe it had a run, these Enlightenment values had a run, but there's all these negatives now, and say what you will about the authoritarians in Russia and China, but they don't have trans twerking hour or something like that.
Well, first of all, does anybody believe that if we gave government more power over the economy, these problems would be solved? Secondly, it's what is happening with ESG and all of this effort by some to use the retirement savings of tens of millions of Americans to promote their social agenda. Is the law is being violated. We have fiduciary laws that say that if I invest money, it shall be invested solely for my benefit, not for the benefit of someone who has a social agenda that wants to do it with my pension fund. So I think, first of all, Republicans need to demand that the law be enforced. We've got some conservative attorney generals in the states who are starting that effort. And it's something we ought to grab hold of when we have a Republican majority in Congress. Capitalism works when you let it work. But what has happened is you've got this pressure now coming from government. You've got a small number of funds, index funds, that were so efficient in helping people diversify their investment that we now see a small number of people using their control of those funds to promote an agenda that is not the agenda of the people whose money we're talking about. And that needs to be stopped.